Yeah, the temperature certainly dropped.
Fire's nice.
Anyway, that's why I light up the fire, isn't it? Don't want the doggy to be cold.
Yeah. Well, you have the same clothes on. I pretty much have the same clothes on.
I would
From last time?
that's about my around the house jumper. This is a new pant from Op Shops.
Oh, very good. I should have got the pants in the shop.
$4 the jumper too, by the way.
$4 off shop.
Yeah.
That's good. I'm gonna take this off.
Yeah, no, that's the jumper I wear around the house, and it's quite comfortable and warm.
Yeah, looks good.
Old army jumpers in wool.
Yeah. You get it in Australia?
Yeah, just in Yard Junction. The Op Shop is there.
Well, we both wanted to do something about Israel-Palestine conflict, or say something about it. And last time we talked, I was keen to talk about America and their relationship with other countries, their foreign policy, and how it might be impacting Israel-Palestine conflict, but also hear some stories from you, because you've had so much experience. Not to make too much of you, because I know you don't want that, but you've had a lot of experience. For example, we're looking at Iraq and Somalia, some two countries that you've had some experience in that America has also been in.
Yep.
And I'm kind of curious about what America's role is, whether they reacted, wisely and proportionately to the situations that they've entered into, and how that can, if that can give any reflections about the current conflict.
It can and it cannot, I guess, partially because the recent, I would say, transformation in the US with the arrival of somebody like Trump. Not that I consider Trump as we seem to forget, he's just kind of the figurehead or the person being manipulated by a small group with a very specific ideology that came into power when Trump was elected the first time, which is now back in power. So they've introduced a big change on some ways, at least in speech, where it's all about America first. And they want to disengage themselves from certainly the rest of the world conflict, or being the policeman of the world, while in the same time economically and on some aspect militarily get engaged even more, get even more militarized. Partially because transforming what they've been doing forever is difficult. Partially because there's a real push from the, let's call it military-industrial complex in the States to sell more and more of their hardware, and certainly trying to convince majority of the non-China, non-Russia part to buy their hardware instead of somebody else's hardware. So, and demonstrating how it works is part of what's going on in the same time. And of course then the internal politics of the US for the moment, which is a bit worrying on many levels, with a mix between clearly a big social trouble back in the US and a kind of image of relation with the rest of the world that impact economic, of course, but that impact as well lots of power relation. So what's interesting when I think my exposure to the US is in two kind of contradiction level. The first level is humanitarian colleagues or people that were working with USAID, all the different sub-branch of the humanitarian / development aid in the States previously, which tended to be quite probably educated, having a different vision of the world than you can find in the States. People with whom you could have a real dialogues, a real understanding of situation. Yeah, they had to follow the policy of their government, the priority of the government to some extent, but they were nonetheless kind of representative of a more world open kind of people. And then the second exposure then comes really with the military / civilian authorities attached to the military. So Iraq is a good example, of course, because on some ways you had the military intervention, and I won't come back on the legal aspect of this intervention, of this invasion, and so on, but there was a purely kind of military component. And then, of course, when the Iraqi Saddam government collapsed, the de facto American became the occupation authority. That was their official title. The transitional occupation. I don't remember the exact words they were using.
Under Bremer was his first name.
Under Bremer, which was the proconsul, to use a term we were using, representing the top authorities, but with a little token of the so-called other member of the coalition, which were mainly British, a token Australians, a token Polish, a token Italian. I'm trying to remember the one I was dealing with, but they were really token people. They were just there to pretend there was a coalition. The same on the military level, where you had 24 Australian soldiers protecting few officials and pretending to participate with one or two fighter jets. British had, of course, a bit more of an involvement, but even there, on a political level, they were not that present when we were dealing with the transition occupation authority, which was mainly American. And large part of them were, of course, civilians, directly under the control of the American government. And that's where you then become confronted with...
Iraqi civilians?
No, Americans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. All the occupation, the occupation authorities were all, for the initial first months, were all American. They had some technical people that were non-Americans, few Europeans, but they were more on a very technical level, health, water, without any real authority. In fact, there are people with whom very quickly we were, as humanitarian, in a positions where they were putting on us all their frustrations and difficulty on trying to have the occupation authority understanding the situation. And that's why I come back to this second level, where having been mainly exposed to more internationally open, educated, understanding with a good part of humanitarian thinking, to people that had no idea, but it's to the caricatural level on anything else than the American way of doing things, and on
That was more the army,
society.
the army kind of, the military.
Not only the paradoxically, and that's one of the elements which I kind of remember well, because I had so many middle rank, I would say up to colonel in the American army, coming back on when I was discussing with them on being themselves frustrated. And I even remember one very specific colonel with whom I was speaking with, which really was extremely frustrated. And I remember his specific sentence who said, "We invaded the country, we tried to damage as little as possible because we knew we had to have a future for the country. So militarily, as little damages as possible, which you could indeed argue the military component up to the fall of Baghdad, militarily, they didn't destroy lots of the infrastructure." And then he was saying, and now those guys are smashing the country to pieces. I'm not speaking the basic soldiers, which was so uneducated, so non-understanding the situation. So anything without an American uniform was the enemy and dangerous and to be shot at if possible. I'm speaking the one small, those middle rank, where lots of them, after the end of the proper kind of war fighting, were trying to have the country working back to some level on the technical level. Some at the time she was a major, then she became a lieutenant colonel, which was following with us lots of the health element around Baghdad. A colonel that was in charge of trying to put back the water and sewage system. Another colonel that was trying to have the electricity network repaired. And which were so frustrated about the complete lack of understanding by the politicians, I would say, the political element in charge of the occupation force. Their total lack of understanding of the situation, their total lack of interest to understand the situation. And I think the de-Ba'athification was, of course, what came out a lot publicly about this, where they were going down the rank of the Ba'ath party without having any interest to understand how a country under the control of a political entity like the Ba'ath party or like the Nazi in Germany previously, how it works. How you at several levels in the ranking, you had to be a member of the party, otherwise you could not get a job, and you had to be to a certain level of the party to get a higher job. It doesn't mean you were following the ideology of the party as such, but you had no choice.
Yeah,
That's the and the
so
complete.
You probably didn't need to fire 400,000
Yeah, they didn't need to fire. So the army, when they disbanded the army, already was for lots of us that had a minimum exposure on the Iraqi situation, already for us a bit of a worry, because it was literally putting on the streets with nowhere to survive people that had a minimum military training, had access to weapons, because the society was flooded with weapons anyway, not only the one in the hand of the army, and resentment against them being fired. That was a recipe for disaster anyway. But of course, all the technical civilian component of the society, where there was very, very little private sector, so everything was de facto public, if you want. Water, sewage, electricity, health, education, anything you can imagine. Yeah, if you fired anybody up to, well, at some time up to really the basic nurse, doctor, teacher, well, you're finishing to destroy the way the society works.
I mean, wasn't that part of the agenda to privatize everything as well?
Well, that was part of the agenda, definitely, without the understanding that there was no private sector to start with.
Yeah.
It's not like you had a part of the system that was privatized with whom you could build something. No, that didn't exist.
Yeah.
So if you disband the public one, you stop the government and all the services that is provided. And that's why electricity was such an issue, water was an issue, the public transport, fuel, health, obviously.
Did you have any contact with the company Halliburton?
No, because they were not that present. The company, the American company, because once more you had these elements of, and that was the case in Afghanistan as well, where lots of the money, the funds that were officially publicized as putting back into the reconstruction of the country, in example, were in reality contract given to mainly, once more, outside of the token British and maybe an Australian one. They were all American company, the big Bechtel and equivalent, where basically they just pocketed the money with no work being done.
And they subcontracted out several levels.
Yeah, but even on this level, there was no. I can give an example because that definitely is something I was directly confronted with, being in charge of a humanitarian organization that was working in the health sector. But so we were trying to put back lots of the what's called polyclinic in order, some of the hospitals, and that involved some repair, rehabilitation of those that has been damaged during the war. There wasn't that many in reality, but damage by looting after, which was a bit more common, or just being neglected before, so a very old installation. So we are trying to have a minimum rehabilitation and repair to put them back in service. And then the occupation authority gave contracts to Bechtel, which then subcontracted probably few Iraqi pseudo company. And the only rehabilitation was they've painted the outside of the building to, and when I say it's a caricature, not doing anything inside to make it work. But when I say painted, because probably the joke, and I never knew for sure, but the joke was they probably were kind of paying people per square meter, they painted everything, including the windows. So we arrived and we had a fully painted building, including all the windows, which we had then to clean because there's not much light passing through a window that has been painted.
No.
Yeah, the glass. When I said the window, not the frame, I'm thinking the glass because probably was 20 meter by 10 meter. That's 200 square meter, and so there was to this caricature level, and with of course of repainting something like that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, I'm sure, in the contract. When you put the total amount they're supposed to have spent on this repair and rehabilitation. Which for a few $1,000s we were doing a far better job for each of the clinic. So that was to this caricature, and lots of procurement, lots of work element, repair of stuff were done to the same level. Lots of the destruction of the public facilities came after during the looting, which we totally, and when I say we, because I was part of it, trying to, at the time I was early on, so the contacts were not that big, but trying to find somebody in the American army, convincing them that the looting, the destruction of any civil servant and civil service was going to be a disaster in the future, as it proved to be.
Why didn't they stop it? Because this was
because on this level for them, they once more the total misunderstanding of what is a political overlay party like the Ba'ath party versus the structure of the government. We hear this now when you listen on the Hamas Ministry of Health, where basically if you listen to the Israeli government and army, any person working for what they call the Hamas government is a Hamas terrorist. And that was a bit the same idea at the time, which is, well, if they were working with the government, they were Ba'ath party, so they were bad guys, so who cares? But in this case, yeah, you had everything destroyed that allow you to restart in a system where everything is public, the services. So in example, it was my analysis when I arrived, and I arrived in Baghdad before the end of the fighting. I was in Baghdad when the fighting was there, and the government, official Iraqi government had not yet fallen. So I saw the American arriving, taking over, the looting starting. And I had a position which I had some difficulty to have my own organization understand and many other organizations understand. That's for me the main disaster was going to be the destruction of any civil service infrastructure of the country. The fact that you were destroying all the filing, all the buildings, and de facto the disappearance of a government that runs all the services, for me was going to be the emergency in the future. So in example, instead of doing what we would maybe have done in a normal situation, where we would have started supporting hospital or polyclinics to provide services to the people, which we still did anyway, of course, but for me was, okay, how can we get the middle rank technical people of the Ministry of Health, because of course I work in the health sector, but later on we're trying to do the same for the water system and sewage system. Finding them, keep them working. So not taking into account the heads of the system, which were indeed the politician, Ba'ath party, real bad guys, but was all the middle level of so the first few days, weeks there, I was really trying to, through some contact I had, finding the director of the preventive services, the person in charge of distributing the drugs to the polyclinics, the guy in charge of the reporting system of the polyclinic, all those what I call technical people, and trying to convince them to go back to work. And at the time where they knew there was no government, no salary, no nothing.
Were they originally laid off by the...
The government just disappeared, so there was no way for them to be paid or anything. Then, of course, after they started to be affected by the firing based on being a member of Ba'ath party, but originally they knew there was no, de facto, no authority, no government, and that their salary would not be paid.
And wait, were you working as under MSF at that time?
No, at the time I was working with a British organization called Merlin, which was originally MSF UK. Okay. And then it became Merlin, medical emergency in the UK, so equivalent to MSF in the way of working.
And so they would have been working for Merlin?
No, at this level, on some level. So I was providing them the resources to work. Well, first of all, trying to convince them to go back to work, which of course was dangerous, because first of all, all the looting was still continuing. There were people being killed, so it was not so simple to say just go back to work in your normal things. The Ministry of Health had been looted, so it was a 17-story building, and the first 13 level had been totally destroyed. Basically, all the bottoms had been burned. The higher you are going, the less destructions. Yes, he likes to be the center of the world.
Absolutely.
And it's up above the 13th floor that was not damaged too much, because you had to go up. There was no power or elevators. Yeah. So it discouraged the looter. So we restarted the ministry from 15th to 17th floor, but convincing them to go to work, explaining us, accepting de facto that they were working with us. Yep. And my idea was indeed convincing them that we needed to know what was left of the health services. And of course we started the 2 Baghdad governorates, and trying to keep those centers alive and supplying them. We reassess all the polyclinics of the 2 Baghdad governorates, then the 2 or 3 other governorates around, including Anbar, which contain Fallujah, in example, so not exactly very, very safe area. And so within the first two months, and if you remember, so it's 20 years ago, so you were a bit young maybe, but if that the country was in an entire mess, we reassessed, including for the first time in the Kurdish autonomous area, nearly all, so 892 polyclinic of the country. And for the first time since 91, the first Gulf War, you had Iraqi ex-official from the Ministry of Health going with the agreement of the Kurdish Ministry of Health in Kurdistan with some of the Kurdish member of the two Kurdish area Ministry of Health, reassessing using a standardized evaluation of the polyclinics, the needs, the activities, their stocks, who was working, condition of the building. I still have the database, in fact. I kept it as more as a memory after. Lots of them were still working with lots of difficulties. Some had been taken over by some groups, including some of the Shia groups, in example. So part of my job was convince those groups that, yes, let's make a little committee around the polyclinic, but let's the polyclinic work without interferences. And that was an interesting political exercise at the time. But the reality is we did manage to have a very comprehensive database, managed to resupply initially the worst polyclinics that had no drugs, to bring them back to work, then brought WHO after to try to convince for us to have access to the very large stock of drugs that was still in some of the ex-government warehouse. Not all of them had been looted, fortunately, but trying to keep alive this structure, and that was this team of technical level Iraqi that did the extraordinary work and the extraordinary difficulties. It did allow as well, this database was then used by lots of the NGOs after to define which part they wanted to support, where, first of all, where were the health centers. So that was used on many levels but mainly for me it kept this middle level management that for some time managed to keep the structure alive. I say sometime because when the real kind of hostage taking for money started to happen, lots of those people were targeted because they had money or perceived as having money, and some being part of those multiple different minorities, non Shia or Sunnis minority, ultimately majority of left the country really. But at least for the first couple of years before it really became messy, they maintained lots of the structure. But to come back to the link we had then with the American authorities, first of all was trying to be disassociated from the American army or the American authorities as an independent humanitarian organizations, all of us. Initially, an example, every time one of my team was arriving to a polyclinic, half an hour after, you had an American army vehicle arriving there to try to show they were supporting the population. That was the famous Art and Mind operation for the Iraqi population. Trouble, of course, for us was being associated with occupation force was not something first of all, we do like, and second, on the risk level, was pretty dangerous. And I can give an example because I said we were working in the Amba Governorate province, which includes Fallujah and Anbar itself, which were the two hotspots for quite a while, and which took us a bit of time, and took me, because I was doing the negotiations, to be able to make sure we could support the polyclinics and one hospital without being disturbed by the bad guys bracket. But the fact we at some time maintained to this differentiation, I was a couple of times contacted to say, well, maybe for the next couple of days it will be good if you don't come and visit Fallujah. And indeed, usually the day after there was big fighting happening. So they were differentiating us. And at the time where any American convoy traveling around was at some time or another attacked, I could have my cars moving without being shot at. Which was a bit of the difficulty working for us at the time, because, in example, in Baghdad, we needed to be very well identified, with our vehicles being very well identified. And we had a fight with the British, but with the American as well, because that's when they started moving in white car with big humanitarian writing on the side in Arabic. And then you had soldiers getting out of those cars. It's like, oops, not
getting out of the humanitarian labeled cars.
Yeah. And they so-called for them, but we are bringing drugs to the health center. So so it's not exactly the same same thing.
That's surely a big breach of protocol, right?
Yep, that's not supposed to happen. And of course, for us, it was very dangerous, because at the end, you see a white car with a big writing on it. Is it going to be stupid people in white jacket getting out, or is it going to be people with guns going out? And we don't like this kind of uncertainty. That's why we have big marked car. If somebody puts a bullet in your car, you know it's not a mistake.
Did you have conversations with people about what the incentives might be for those higher up in the transitional authority?
Well, part were purely the normal administration level, of course. So for them, they were just on a civilization path for the good one. Majority, lots of them were there because, well, in the States, I work as an administrator of something, and there were lots of young graduates on top of it. I can go in Iraq and I'm going to make $200,000.
Right. Okay. So at that level,
yeah, of course, lots of them.
Lots
of them were
pretty simple.
I mean, if I take myself as the head of, at the time, one of the major humanitarian organizations in Iraq, the truck drivers driving the American army supplies, so private companies having a contract with the army, a truck driver was probably making 8 times my salary.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So lots of money to be made.
On this level, there was no... But it's more this complete lack of understanding of the other societies that for me was the big surprise.
I mean, if they're getting paid from external funding, then what's their incentive to understand the society? Because they're going to get paid whether or not they understand the society, right?
Yes, but the point is then they struggle to do anything.
Overall, is there a link between Iraq, your experience in Iraq, and what may be happening in Israel, Palestine, do you think?
Well, first of all, there is this idea that there is, well, people that are less than people, definitely. And the way the Palestinians have been defined by the Israeli government military is certainly linked to that, where once more Israel government population is seen as us versus the others. So we pretend it's the only democracy in the Middle East. So if they're democracy, they like us. Of course, the reality of a very large part of the Israeli population is European migration. So they are de facto a bit like us. The society is a bit like us, contrary to other Middle East countries that are mainly Muslims. They don't exactly look like us. So there is definitely this factor that plays. After, I think we are back to the same thing between Hamas bracket and the society, where because you run the government, everything associated with the government is an Hamas, and of course if you Hamas, you're a terrorist by definition. So it will be like, I could take a controversial example, but why not? Israel. So any civil servant will be fair target because they are the government of Israel. If I'm placing myself in the idea of, if I'm applying the same principle on one of the warring faction, so any civil servant, irrelevant of who they are, is Israeli government who is the enemy, so is fair game. So hospitals, health workers, people maintaining the water system, the sewage system, and I'm specifically giving those examples because they were specifically targeted in Gaza. Or if you apply the same principle, where everybody above 18 in Israel, men and women, are reservists, so can be military, were military, or can become military, so they become fair game. And since 90% of the households probably have one of those persons, that's about, there is always a man or a woman in kind of any household, then every household is a fair target. And okay, well, the children were too bad, collateral damage. But we are targeting the reservist in this household. So at the end, then 90% of the household become a target. So if you start thinking that way, that's what's happened. You have no more idea of de facto combatant. Everybody become, and of course, if I'm pushing even more the caricature, which is, well, yes, there is children, but the children that when they're 18 will become soldiers. So since like the Palestinian children are future terrorists, well, Israeli children are future soldiers, so may as well kill them now. You arrive to this completely absurd way of thinking where we accept de facto genocide in Palestine based on those kind of stupid principles.
And in Iraq you saw something similar?
No, because there was not an attempt to eradicate a population. They were not taken into account. They were not listened. They were not. They were all considered bad guys and people you don't listen to. But there was no attempt to eradicate the population like there is in Gaza.
Well, you mentioned that you were in the photo one of the photos.
Oh, I'm
of
joking
the,
because I'm not sure I am, but yes,
Okay,
I was there when the famous
the
film of the Saddam statues being down. I was watching that on the
Yeah.
side street.
and I looked at some of the pictures, and it makes sense. You said that
There was not a big population there.
Yeah, there was some people around the statue, but
Yeah, as soon as you were opening a little, there was nobody.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I was there. I had arrived a few days before that.
I guess that's kind of illustrates what you're saying. You've got the people in the frame, the people who are important for whatever purposes of.
There was a real
transitional
resentment
authority,
in the
but-
population against Saddam. Saddam was a dictator that was oppressing the population to a large extent, particularly all non member of his brackets tribe, or not Sunni Iraqis, but even the Sunnis, lots of different groups were oppressed as much. Sometimes more because they were potentially seen as a political risk, while some other, like the Christians, were not seen as politically risky.
But then you still have all the invisible people who stayed at home because they're afraid.
Yeah, of course.
Because of the bombs.
Because they don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So
And they are not in the frame.
No, they
They're
are
not
not. They are
considered.
not. They are not listened. They are not understood. But they are the majority of the people. And I mean, when I came back saying this group of technical guys in the Ministry of Affairs, I was very clear with them from the start, because I had a couple of contacts. We found some, then we extended, and then we had a kind of a meeting with 30 of them. And I was very clear that was going to be difficult. They were going to be challenged. That's going to be risky. That I understood perfectly if they didn't want to do it. That staying at home until there is a bit more clarity was far safer. But I provide them my analysis of the situation, saying it's the destruction of this civil infrastructure, which for me was going to become the emergency. That's what I was proposing them, and perfectly understood for those that were not willing to work with us to do that. And I think there was only one, which mainly for family reasons, didn't participate to the job, and they took lots of risk. And lots of the basic population own a debt of gratitude to those guys, which they would never know about it and would never be acknowledged. The resentment there was on the population against Saddam was there for a very large majority. The expectation that things will get better was there, and that's why the initial reaction of the population was not negative against the occupation armies. It just became such when things didn't improve, things were totally unclear, decisions like firing more and more of the public staff, the basic needs were not answered, so the resentment really arose in the population. It's been a little the same in Somalia when there was the humanitarian military operations. Very different, because you could argue, in Iraq there was no humanitarian principle under the military intervention. The reasons given were fake, as we all know. In Somalia, there was the military intervention was on humanitarian ground.
Is this you're talking about 1990?
Yeah, I'm speaking in the 90s. Yeah, in the 90s.
Yeah.
It started very early in the 90s, where the situation degraded so much in Somalia that indeed at some time, personally, for me, an example, there was hardly any way to deal with some of the armed groups, because there was, if you deal with a rebel armed groups, which has the idea that they represent a population, they want to become a government, you then have arguments of discussions that, well, you need to take care of your population, first of all. Second, if you want to pretend to be a government, well, then try to behave like one. Providing services you are not able to do, we can provide services. You don't totally interfere. You can negotiate, including some security incidents. I mean, I've been in situations where some of the humanitarian were ambushed and killed. Take an example in Central Africa, My reaction was very different from lots of the other humanitarian organizations. Mainly because, for me, yes, that was an incident. Yes, we've lost 2 people. That's terrible. But I consider we still could work in the area simply because the head of the armed group of the area, when he was informed of the incident, had the people doing the incident found, so some of his soldiers, judged, I'm not sure they were really judged, they were more shot on the spot. But at least the message from the group, the armed group, from the guy in charge was very clear. You can't blame somebody to control every single soldier all the time. It doesn't exist. But there's a big difference between them doing nothing and them finding the guy and the guys, the group doing that, and shoot them as a very clear message that you don't touch those guys. Then I think in this level, it can work. It's very different that if you, the people don't react, and it's like, well, that's fine, it's fair enough to loot and shoot them. In the case of Somalia, some of the groups were, and I know it's very unpopular in the humanitarian world when I was speaking that way, but for me they're parasite of the society. They have no other interest than living on the back of the population, looting, raping, killing. That's it. That's not. They have no other purpose. With those guys, it's hardly possible to discuss and negotiate and set up something, because they may decide, say I won't touch you, but yesterday you had a car with the salary of the people, so there was money, so I just loot the car and kill the people because there was money in it. Yeah, it become difficult to negotiate. And
was there a stated intent to govern from any of those groups?
At some time, some couple, yes, majority, no. And that was the difficulty to work in the area, and why to many levels lots of area we could not access, because if you arrive and the only thing they're interested is looting your car, potentially raping whoever they can rape, and steal anything they can steal of, well, then it's very difficult to work in those contexts.
So when was this? This was, again, early 90s?
That was already in the early 90s.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was particularly difficult then to work in the area. Some of the mistake done a little before, not so much to a larger scale, more after, was then basically, and that's a mistake I personally disagreed with, was, well, then we're going to pay one group to protect us. But first of all, it's expensive. Second, you become totally dependent of this group. If there's a stronger other group, it's like, well, I'm missing out, so let's get them. And so you become, it's become an impossible game. And up to the time, at the time, one of the group can say, well, if I kill this one protected by the other group, then the others will have to come to me for protection. So it's become a protection racket, basically, which then is impossible to... And it then limits your operation on the area where you may or may not be protected by the group you're paying.
Okay, so what's the context at this stage? Like, what had happened before you came in?
In where? In
Somalia?
Well, there was at the origin, you could call that a drought, which in a society that is at the end quite fragile in terms of the resources, any drop in food production become a real issue. When on top of it, it's linked to a large insecurity where on top of it, basically, you can't have what there is a bit everywhere, which is, well, yeah, they don't have much food here, but here we have a bit more. Drought hardly ever touch 100% of the area. So, well, there's a good business to bring the food there. So there's a kind of a commercial, let's say, balance on availability of food. In the case of Somalia, not only was there a large-scale drought in a already kind of fragilized population, where the insecurity and the interfighting, once more, you're not speaking two groups here, you're speaking about 100 different armed groups. These kind of movements of goods become impossible, and that's became an absolutely major humanitarian disaster.
So the commercial food production couldn't really fill in the gap?
No, because, well, it would not have been able in the case of Somalia, but at least it will have, to some area, limited the extent of the disaster, where no food was available, while you had some food available a bit further away.
And was Siad Barre still in power?
Yeah, well, there was, depend what you mean by power, when you control only in reality, a small part of the territory.
Was that the case? Because he had a fairly long reign, didn't he?
Yep.
So was that the case?
That was towards the end. Yeah, that was towards the end when the control over the reality of the country. At the end, when you control the capital, yes, you're the official government, but you just control the capital.
And there's a lot of clans vying for power.
Yeah, powers, or just some semi-nomadic societies live off pillaging the other group when they have a little more. It's not popular once more to say that, but it is the reality. There is some mainly semi-nomadic groups that are living off raiding, mainly agriculture, that produce the food, or other semi-nomadic tribes stealing the cattle, and that's been traditional since ever. when things become even more difficult, then that tends to amplify and break down. Access to weaponries, of course, makes it even having more impact. So when a military intervention was decided in those kind of context, it's always very difficult. First of all, speaking of an humanitarian military intervention is always difficult.
Is that conjoining of those two things, which is not necessarily safe or advisable?
If you manage to separate, which of course is difficult, but if you manage to separate where you have a military intervention that indeed provide a security level in the population, and at the end humanitarians are part of the population. Even if we come from outside, we become part of the system, without interfering on other elements. Maybe the trouble is, of course, there is always an interference, because it's always come with a political element. Those humanitarian military interventions. Theo. So of course, intervening from an outside force with a political element to say, well, we want to have a government. Anybody coming from outside trying to create a government, that's not a good recipe as far as I'm concerned. There's not many places it has worked, unless the only thing you do is provide the context of security and let the local work out their political element. Trouble of that is it takes time, it's complex. But I think there is a joke that says there is always simple solutions to very complicated problem, and it's always the bad one. And that's the reality of society that are all complex. We can take the example to come back on Israel and Palestine for the moment. So here, 3 days ago, they announced a new plan, peace plan for Gaza. That doesn't include whatsoever the Palestinians. This plan is totally decided by others. There is no input in any way, shape or form by Palestinians. There is no idea if it is even acceptable or not. That's not going to work. Particularly when on top of it you remove from this plan what is at the origin of the problem and provide impunity for the party that is majority responsible for the problem. One of the elements of the peace plan which nobody seems to mention, but it's basically that and there is not going to be any prosecution or follow-up or anything on Israel. So basically we forget that they are conducting a genocide and all is good. That's not going to work. And of course it doesn't include the Palestinians in terms of their future self-determinations, having a country of their own, and so on. So, and that's just going to be delayed. The Israeli government's going to say, well, we need to study the details, and eventually it will not go anywhere. You arrive and do not take into account the population, the structure, the past, or anything to propose something for them. In Iraq, that was the case.
In Somalia.
Somalia was the case with probably a little more difficulty, an ambivalence, where the initial phase of the military intervention would have been difficult to implement because not soft, but the main element that I was saying, providing security and creating a context where there is a security for the population, was not able to be done without a very nasty way of doing it. Meaning, we remove weapons. Anybody with weapons, you get shot at. And then when that is done, you can do something else. And as I was saying before, originally at the beginning of the military intervention, all different armed groups in Somalia, and if you look in the history, the initial military intervention was not opposed by anybody armed firing at the soldiers. There was a moment where indeed things got quiet, and that was mainly because in the mind of the Somalis armed guys, whoever they were, in their spirit is gun is power. Use it. And when they had suddenly people arriving with big guns, and lots of them, for them it was, well, they are going to kill me because that's what I will do if I was in their position. So I'm certainly not going to be anywhere close, and I'm hiding my guns because on my way of thinking, they're just going to shoot me. And that's why there was no opposition. And then when later on all the different groups, first of all, were left out of any potential discussions on what kind of government to set up. And second, realized that, they are not shooting at me. In fact, I can go and loot there and they are not shooting at me. So let's go back on doing what I was doing. And then eventually felt empowered enough to oppose militarily the armies that were there. The famous Black Hawk Downs operation that became a nice movie, but that was somehow the belief in the Iraqi warlords, to use a term that was used, that at the end they were not risking annihilation if they were opposing militarily, because their experience had been, those guys are not serious, they may have big guns but they are not using them. And then of course all the discussion to set up a government was only with a limited number of people.
And the key players were excluded. And then apparently there was
key players, or those things take lots of time. And the idea for those forces would have been, okay, well, we're going to be here for 10 years because that's what it's going to take for any kind of civil government able to work. That's what's the time that's going to be needed. That's not the way those intervention works. We want them to be short, and because they're expensive, you do get few soldiers killed, which is in our country is not very popular. And as I was saying, trying to find a short, simple solutions to very complex societal problem is not going to happen. A friend of mine that was doing his master in international diplomacy in the States, who, as I said, was shocked when discussing why they didn't learn other languages. They were clear, and once more those were future US diplomats, that they don't need to, because English is the language everybody should be speaking. It's the international language, and the fact that you may be posted in a country that doesn't have an English history doesn't matter. The trouble is when this way of thinking comes with a huge amount of potential military power, and in a society where, I mean, what's happened in the States for the moment is worrying on many levels. Economically, of course, because they introduce a disruption in a model which I don't say is a good model personally, but nonetheless you can't smash it in no time. It needs to be changed, but it needs to be changed in a certain time frame with an idea of what's happening, and that's certainly not the case. And the speech of invading other countries or imposing an economical model become, people half joke about it, but I'm not totally sure there is a lot to joke about, because the instability that can be pushed is the fact we don't seem to see how quickly it could degenerate. For me, is a bit of a worry.